Welcome everyone to our first grants update webinar of the year. This is Susan Hedstrom, Executive Director for FPWR and mom to a 10-year-old son with PWS. I am thrilled that you have chosen to join us today. FPWR is making great progress towards treatments for PWS, and we could not do this without you, our supporters. On today's webinar, Dr. Theresa Strong will give a brief overview of PWS trial opportunities and research initiatives that are currently underway, as well as an overview of the FPWR grant program and details on each of the 8 recently funded research grants. We will pause periodically to answer any questions that you may have, and we invite you to submit your questions through the GoToMeeting control panel, which you should see on your screen. We will do our best to answer all of your questions before the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Theresa Strong.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know your day is busy, and I appreciate you taking out a little bit of time to hear about what's going on in FPWR and in PWS research. There we go, sorry. So just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the FPWR research team, which is growing beautifully. Although I did notice that we need to add some Y chromosomes, we'll get on that. But for right now, we are a very girl-powered group of dedicated researchers. Myself, I'm Director of Research Programs. Natalie Kayajanian is Director of Translational Research. Jessica Bahanowicz is the Associate Director of Research Programs, and she particularly helps on the grant program as well as the registry. Lauren Roth is mom to Emma and is a clinical psychologist who works with us part-time to advance the mental health work that FPWR is focused on. Lisa Medesvec is the PATH study coordinator for the natural history study on serious medical events in PWS that we're working on. And we've just been joined by Carolyn Vrana Diaz, who is a newly minted PhD and is the research project coordinator. So she's helping with a lot of the special projects that we're working on here at FPWR. So before we jump into the new grants and new projects that we're funding, I did want to take a moment and remind you that we have a lot of clinical trials ongoing for PWS, and we're really excited to see all of these opportunities for new treatments for PWS come about. And, you know, we're really interested in getting these different drugs and therapies tested to see if they're going to be helpful for our kids. So the only way that we're going to get new treatments for PWS is if we as a PWS community work to advance these treatments. So I will ask you to keep informed about the potential new therapies that are coming down the line, and we've tried to make that very easy for you. Susan has really worked on the clinical trials page on the FPWR website. She keeps it up to date with all of the clinical trials that are ongoing, what stage they're at, where there are sites. So she's always adding new sites, and she's got this map so you can see if there are new sites near you. There's a place to sign up for a clinical trials alert, as well as some frequently asked questions. We know that, you know, clinical trials, you need to think about whether it's right for you and your family. You need to talk with your doctor. You need to talk with the people who are doing the trial. And so we have some FAQs and some things that you might want to think about as you consider whether a clinical trial is right for you. In addition, as you see all of these clinical trials, as you click on each one of them, for almost all of them now, we have a video that talks, the sponsor usually has provided, that talks about the clinical trial, who it's open to, what the proposed mechanism of action is, you know, what the eligibility criteria and what the time commitment is, and whether there's funds available to support your travel to those sites. So again, I would ask you to stay aware of the clinical trials that are ongoing, gather information, find out if these treatments might be right for you and your loved one with PWS. The other thing that I urge everyone in the PWS community to participate in is the Global PWS Registry. This is a critical resource for supporting our understanding of PWS, our understanding of the complications that our kids have, and also for advancing clinical trials and clinical research. So we're using the registry, again, to understand the natural history of PWS, to understand why our kids are going to the hospital, what complications they're experiencing. We're using it to gather information that the FDA needs to understand the impact of PWS on the person and on the family. And we're also using the registry to test new measures of behavior and other aspects of PWS that can be used in clinical trials. I think it's useful for us to keep a running record of your child's medical history and have all of that information in one place. And it's also an opportunity to stay on top of the clinical trial opportunities that are available. So if you're eligible for a clinical trial, we'll send you that information, and then you have the option of contacting the sponsor or the site if you think that trial might be good for you. So please consider enrolling in the Global Registry, and if you're already enrolled in the Global Registry, making sure that your records are up to date. The other thing I want to mention is the Path for PWS Natural History Study that is ongoing through the Global PWS Registry. This is open to individuals with PWS ages 5 and up, and it's a completely remote clinical study. So it is just providing information over the course of the next 4 years about any serious medical events that happen to the person with PWS. And it also at 6-month intervals will ask you about the behavior of the person with PWS so that we can get an idea of how do these behaviors change over time. When does hyperphagia really come on? Are there other behaviors that are associated with that? So we would love for you to participate if your child is over the age of 5 in the Path for PWS study. If your child is between 0 and 4, we hope that you'll participate in the registry as well, which is similar and gathers similar information. So please visit the Path for PWS website for more information about the Path study. And on the clinical trials webpage that we have on the FPWR site, in addition to drug-based studies, we also have non-drug clinical trials, so behavioral interventions, other studies to examine aspects of PWS. I just want to mention 2 of those now, 2 studies that are FPWR funded and are really aimed at, we hope, improving behavior and family function in PWS. So one is a pilot study for dads. We know dads are a critical part of a family, and when the behaviors of PWS can get challenging, that can be challenging for dads. And so there's a particular approach to that, which is called acceptance and commitment training, that we'd like to try out for dads of kids with PWS age 13 to 18, which can really be some of those challenging years. They're challenging years for all kids, but particularly challenging for those with PWS. So it's a completely online study and will help dads learn to cope with the behaviors that can be so challenging in PWS. A second study is a mindfulness study, again, a completely remote study, so done from the comfort of your home. It's for individuals age 13 to 30 and their caregivers. It will teach the caregiver mindfulness. It will teach the caregiver to teach the person with PWS mindfulness, and then it will measure how that impacts behavior, and particularly whether it reduces temper outbursts in individuals with PWS. Okay, so that's the background, and that is my advertisement to hopefully get you involved in some of the studies that are ongoing. Now I'll turn to our grant program and the new projects that we're funding. You may, if you've been with us for a little while, you've probably seen this slide before. This is the therapeutic development spectrum, all the way from research and discovery into therapies that are used in daily care of individuals with PWS. And FPWR has established a number of programs that is meant to support that developmental pipeline, and those are listed on the bottom. What we're going to focus on today is the grant program, which supports research anywhere along this spectrum of development. And the goal of the grant program is to support particularly innovative or exceptional opportunities anywhere along the research spectrum. And the grant program has been, an integral part of FPWR's program since our inception in 2003. Since then, we've supported more than $12 million in PWS research and over 150 research projects around the globe, so in more than 13 countries. And all of that funding and support has led to more than 150 publications on everything from understanding PWS gene function, which we're still working on, to understanding appetite in PWS, developing new drugs, and optimizing clinical care for individuals with PWS. And importantly, the ways that we measure is the work that we're doing, are we supporting good work? One way is to see, are we getting publications in high profile journals where they'll be shared with other scientists and other scientists can continue to build on that. Another way is another metric that we use is, do we start projects that can then be carried on with funding from other organizations, from the government, from larger foundations than ourselves. And research that has started with FPWR funding has now received an additional more than $20 million in outside funding from other entities. And that again shows us that the work that we're supporting here is starting is useful work and important work that others can pick up and expand upon. In addition, we support the development of new resources that can be used widely by the PWS community. I think that's an important niche for FPWR to fill, and the development of new drugs and insights into clinical care. So there are a number of papers that have come out based on projects that were initiated in our grant program. You can keep up with those on our website under research outcomes, and also if you subscribe to the blog. This slide just shows a few of the papers that have come out in the last few months since the beginning of the year, and you'll see it covers the spectrum, right? Everything from, some of you were involved in developing this task switching game to help kids with PWS learn how to do task switching, move from one activity to another. That's been published. Dr. Hack has worked on the effects of a carbohydrate restricted diet on hormones and metabolism, which is very important to our families. Drs. Boré and Muscatelli are co-funded to look at the circuitry and how that develops in the neurocircuitry of hunger and feeding in models of PWS. And Dr. Zygmunt has come out with a publication looking at the importance of ghrelin in PWS. We know ghrelin is increased in PWS, and we know that ghrelin drives hunger, but Dr. Zygmunt was interested in what function it has very early on in development. And what his group found was that ghrelin is actually a survival mechanism for the newborn mouse and presumably the newborn baby with PWS, that it protects them and helps them survive. And just a fun fact about that paper, one of the authors is Hannah Veroslav, who is the daughter of Alice Veroslav, who is a co-founder of FPWR. And Hannah has recently received her MD degree and did research in Dr. Zygmunt's lab. So we have some generational contributions going on in the PWS community, which is fantastic. I'll just mention one other publication that's come out recently, because I think it's a great example of our role at FPWR and how we can promote research and help find solutions. So one of the things we do as part of our grant program is that we talk to all of our grant recipients midway through their year project to see how things are going and see if we can help out in any way or if there are connections that we can make. And so we had the opportunity to talk to both Dr. Schaff and Dr. Tam at sometime last year about their projects. Dr. Tam was working on bone health in a mouse model of PWS and was looking at the underlying basis of the weak bones that our kids experience. And Dr. Schaff was looking at bone health, particularly in individuals with Schaff-Yang syndrome, in which there's a mutation in the MAGEL2 gene, which is a PWS gene. And it turned out that they were looking at pretty similar things, one in the mouse, one in the human. So we kind of hooked them up together, and they worked together on this very nice publication that just came out recently, looking at the basis of poor bone health in PWS. And so I know you guys are probably, most of you are not scientists, but you can see this is a cross section of a bone from a mouse that has a MAGEL2 deficiency, and you see these big white spots. That's fat in their bone marrow, which is not what you should see, and this was not a fat mouse. And so there's a deficiency here. And if you look in humans with PWS, you see this one metabolite, oleoserine, is decreased. And so they, Doctors Schaff and Tam, thought about that and knew that there was a compound that could correct that deficiency in OS levels, and they fed it to the mouse to see what would happen. And what you can see here is on the left is a bone, the scaffolding of a bone from a normal mouse. In the middle is a PWS mouse, and on the right is a PWS mouse that has received this compound. And you can see that the bone, there's more matrices, there's a stronger bone structure there, and that's shown here. So they basically looked at mice, looked at humans, found the basis of why the bones are brittle in both mouse and humans, and then found a compound that might strengthen bones. So this technology has now been licensed to a company that we're talking to about potential next steps in bringing this to patients and hopefully helping them with their bone health. So there are many issues in PWS, and bone health is not always the first one we think of. But our kids can't exercise and they can't stay healthy if they don't have strong bones. So if we're able to address that, I think that would be a wonderful thing. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the work that's ongoing from previously funded projects. Now I'll mention the new projects that we're funding in the spring of 2019. So these are projects that were submitted for review last fall, and we're now have approved these and are providing the funding. And there's 8 of them, and I'll split them up a little bit. The first 2 are advancing PWS knowledge, looking at PWS genetics. And the first one is from University of Connecticut, which is looking at the modifications of RNA in PWS cells. So you'll remember, if you've listened to any of these webinars, you've probably seen the slide before, and you know that the PWS region is super complicated. There are a bunch of protein coding genes shown over here, and then we have these unusual genes called SNORDs, SNORD116 in particular. It seems to be very important because if it gets deleted, people have characteristics of PWS. And it's not known what these RNAs do. They make long RNAs, they make short RNAs. We have some hints from some work that we've previously supported. Dr. LaSalle and her colleagues have shown that these genes are important in establishing circadian rhythm in the cells and important in metabolism. We've funded others who are looking at other functions of these SNO RNAs, but it's still an incomplete picture. And so Dr. Carmichael from University of Connecticut has been studying this. He's been studying RNAs for a number of years, and particularly the SNO RNAs for a number of years. He's an RNA expert, and he's developed some novel techniques to really understand what these SNO RNAs are doing. And in this study, he's going to use a genome-wide approach using neurons derived from individuals with PWS to identify what are the targets of those SNORD RNAs. So we're excited about this project because this is an experienced investigator who's got a long-term commitment to understanding what these RNAs are doing. He's developed this novel technology which has never been applied to the question of PWS before, and he's got an excellent collaborative team. So he is working with others at the University of Connecticut. You may recall that Dr. Stormy Chamberlain is there, and she has done a lot of excellent work as well. So a super good team. The long-term goal here is to understand the molecular basis of PWS and define the function of the SNORD116 genes, and by so doing, hopefully identify novel therapeutic targets. So that's the first study we're supporting. The second study is from Michael Telkowski at Mass General, and this is the second year of a project, the title of which is CRISPR-MEDIATED molecular dissection of PWS. So we know that there's several genes in the PWS region, as our diagram showed, but we don't know the exact contribution of each of them to the characteristics of PWS. So this team does a lot of CRISPR technology. They're kind of they're a high throughput team that is really technology based, and so they're using CRISPR technology to generate a series of cell lines that have the individual genes in the PWS region cut out very precisely. And the novel thing about this in particular is they're all done on the same background, genetic background, so the same cell, and then they clip out gene 1, gene 2, gene 3. And so the comparison can be very tight. It's a nice comparison about what each gene does individually. So they've had a year of funding, and they have made tremendous progress making large deletions and small deletions of the PWS region. And what they want to do in year 2 is do kind of a gene by gene approach and put it into the same workflow. Their workflow is shown here, where they design the CRISPRs, they make the cells, they characterize the cells, they do advanced genomics, all on the PWS cells. And the nice thing about this is it's building a resource that can be used by all the members of the PWS research community. So they'll deposit that into the stem cell bank that we have, and there'll be very precise excisions of PWS genes. And the Telkowski lab is they're very much involved in other neurodevelopmental disorders, other causes of autism, and other syndromes that occur in humans, and they'll be able to compare PWS to those other syndromes. And sometimes by doing that very large comparison, you can get a real idea of pathways that are similarly affected in PWS and other neurodevelopmental disorders. The next 2 studies have to do with understanding hyperphagia and appetite and satiety in PWS. The first one is from a young investigator, Dr. Dietrich at Yale University, and he's looking at the functional development of a particular class of hunger neurons in PWS. So he's examining AGRP neurons, which is a class of neurons in the hypothalamus that really drives hunger, also drives some obsessive compulsive behavior. Sounds familiar. And there's evidence that these particular neurons may be overactive in PWS, both in humans and in mice. And so his goal is to use a mouse model of PWS and state-of-the-art neurobiology techniques to determine if these neurons are overactive throughout the development of a mouse model of PWS. We're excited about this project because this is an excellent young investigator who's got a lot of expertise in neurobiology. A few years ago, when we looked at the PWS, kind of the research landscape, we really felt like there was not enough young, smart neurobiologists who were studying PWS. And so we're excited to see that we've been able to support, or are able to support, a couple of new young investigators in the field and get them working on PWS. He is using innovative techniques and approaches. His lab is really sort of, on fire. They just actually published this weekend a paper in Cell, which is really whoop-de-doo deal in the scientific community to have a paper in Cell looking at the normal AGRP neuron function in mouse. And so he'll be applying all of that to understanding PWS. So we're excited about that. In the long term, we hope to define the altered brain circuits that are responsible for some of the most challenging behaviors in PWS, including hunger and OCD behaviors, and establish some new therapeutic avenues to pursue. The other project that is really focused on understanding hunger and satiety in PWS is from Dr. Fox at Purdue University, and it's titled Enhancing Satiation Signaling to Reduce Overeating and Obesity in PWS. So we know for many individuals with PWS, it's not so much the hunger, although that can be quite compelling in some individuals. But in addition or exclusively for some individuals, it is lack of satiety. So people with PWS can eat a lot of food and still not feel full. And so that signaling, how the stomach tells the brain that someone is full, is really not very well understood. And that is what Dr. Fox is focusing on. So the goal here is to determine whether enhancing the signal from the gut up to the hindbrain through this NTS is a way to reduce hunger and reduce eating in a mouse model of PWS. So we're excited about this study because, again, it's using some novel state-of-the-art techniques to examine satiety mechanisms, which are really not well understood even in typical individuals and also in PWS. So that area of the brain, the nucleus tractus solitarius, or the NTS, we'll just call it the NTS, that area of the brain is probably really important in that. And this study will begin to understand that and see how it might apply to reducing hunger and increasing satiety in PWS. So this is halfway through the grants, and I'll pause and see if Susan has any questions so far.
Thank you, Theresa. We do have a couple questions coming in. I would just like to remind everyone who's joined us today that we would love to hear your questions. So if you have any, please feel free to type them into the questions box on your GoToMeeting control panel. We'll try to answer all of our questions before the end of the webinar. Theresa, we have two questions here so far. The first one was in regards to the SHOF and TAM project that you described, looking at the compound for bone health. Is that drug already FDA approved? Is it available, or will it require further clinical trials before we can apply it to PWS?
So it will probably require further clinical trials. So it's actually a derivative of olive oil, right? But olive oil breaks down really quickly. So So I think that a lot of clinicians in the field are really interested in the Mediterranean diet for our kids. And I think that, that includes a lot of olive oil. And in addition to maybe being good for weight control, it may also be contributing to better bone health. So certainly, considering a Mediterranean diet for your kid, I think is a good thing to consider. However, as it is, olive oil breaks down really too quickly to have a strong effect on bone health. And so there are derivatives of olive oil. There's a couple of them that are in development. And depending on sort of how much they have to modify those before they can provide them, they will probably have to go through a typical clinical trial. So that's a bit of a wait and see how the FDA is going to handle that. In the meantime, olive oil is good for our kids, and there's no harm in providing a diet that is rich in olive oil as long as the calories are reasonably maintained. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Sounds like I'll be adding a little bit more olive oil to my sautés over the next couple of years.
Exactly.
We have one more question in the queue, and again, I invite all of you to keep sending questions in as they arise. But this question was regarding the stem cell project you described using the CRISPR technology. Those cells that are being created, could they possibly be used for stem cell therapy for PWS?
So the answer to that is no. Really, this is a project to understand what's going on in the genetics, and the cells that are being used are really only meant to be kind of a high throughput vehicle to understand genetics of PWS. So at this point, it's hard to see how stem cells would be used therapeutically in PWS in a way that is actually beneficial, because the stem cells would not integrate, or we would not expect them to integrate into the brain in a helpful way at this point. So we're keeping our eye on the possibility of stem cell use for PWS, but right now it does not appear to be an avenue that would be productive with the way that we're able to use stem cells to date.
Great. But you did say that they could be used in high throughput screens. So does that mean that these cells will be used to test for new drugs?
Yes, exactly. That's where they're going to be useful. They're going to be useful to understand PWS, and they're going to be useful to screen for drugs. Like if we find a characteristic like, oh, all the cells, they don't have long enough, their synapses or defective or something, then we can do high throughput screening and see if they will improve the synapse biology, for example. So yes, that's where they're going to be useful.
So if I recall, we used high throughput screening once before with Dr. Zhang's study, and he was able to actually find a compound that looked promising in PWS. Will we be able to do this in a greater scale in the future?
Well, it'll be slightly different. So he was specifically looking for compounds that activated gene expression. And what I was talking about is other compounds that might sort of fix a downstream problem. So the structure of the neuron or the functioning of the neuron. So he did do a high throughput screen, but it was really for a different question. It was for, can we turn PWS genes on? So we kind of want to do both of those because we're not clear yet, is gene activation going to work? And if it doesn't, we want to have options for treating the downstream effects of loss of PWS genes.
Great. Well, it looks like we have a couple more grants to go through. Again, we're happy to accept questions as they are coming in. We're going to go through the next few grants, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll go back to more questions. So you're welcome to continue to send them on in. Theresa, I'll give it back to you.
Okay, and speaking of genetic therapy, our next two grants have to do with genetic therapy for PWS. So there are two proposals or two projects that we're going to be supporting in this round that get at this question. You'll remember that everyone with PWS has the PWS region genes sitting there, but silent. So in deletion, you have one maternal chromosome that the genes are there but silent. In UPD or imprinting, we have two maternal chromosomes, the genes are there but silent. So as we've discussed, we've supported some initial work looking at whether you can turn those genes on. And the answer is yes, you can turn those genes on, but we still have a lot of work to do. So Dr. Zhang used a drug that turned those on, and those studies are being followed up with the support of Levo Therapeutics to advance those drugs. We've also supported Dr. Lalande and Dr. Stormy Chamberlain looking at a different approach to turn those genes on, and they were able to correct or activate gene expression in neurons in a dish. But there are still a lot of really important questions that have to be answered before we can start thinking about doing this in people with PWS. So we have to understand whether activating these genes reverses the symptoms, which genes have to be turned on. So there were a bunch of genes in our PWS region. Do they all have to be turned on, or can just some of them be turned on? How much do they have to be turned on? When do they have to be turned on? And what might be, the consequences that, of turning those genes on kind of late in the process. So those are all really important basic feasibility questions we have to address before we advance genetic therapy for PWS. So this first project will really help us answer those questions in a very clean system. So it is the development of a mouse model in which we can turn the genes on and off really cleanly and start to ask these questions. So this will be a mouse model that is born with the SNORD116 gene, so those really important genes silent, but with a genetic switch in there so that those genes can turn on later in development or in different areas during development. So Dr. Resnick is going to use this model to address some of the critical questions about, what would happen if you turned it on in an infant, or a baby mouse in this case, or in an adolescent, or in an adult. Do you get a benefit from that? We're excited about this because Dr. Resnick is a very experienced PWS researcher. He kind of knows the genetics and imprinting of PWS as well as anyone, and so he has a really deep understanding of how to make this model work, which is not easy to do. And I think the model is going to be really useful for many in the field to establish the feasibility of genetic therapy and for us to understand the promise of this approach for our kids eventually. A second project is looking at a different approach to activating some of the genes in the region. So this is a project from Marnie Blewett, who is in Australia, and she has been studying this protein SMCHD1 and has found that it is an important protein in regulating the MAGEL2 gene and other genes, PWS region genes, nectin and mucorin-3, and it is important in silencing those on the maternal allele. And so her study will test whether, if she gets rid of that protein, those particular genes, MAGEL2, nectin, and mucorin, get activated. Will they turn on, and will it have a beneficial effect? So we like this project because Dr. Blewett, this is, sort of a gene that she really understands and has been working on for a long time. This is a novel approach, and it has application potentially to both PWS and to Schaff-Yang syndrome, since MAGEL2 is mutated in Schaff-Yang syndrome. And she'll be working on cells both with PWS and with Schaff-Yang to take a look at how this works in a dish. So the long-term goal of this study is to develop a novel genetic therapy, both for Schaff-Yang and for PWS. And this is a project that has got its start with the Prader-Willi Research Foundation of Australia, which is a completely independent research organization from FPWR, but we are fortunate to work very closely with the Prader-Willi Research Foundation of Australia, and so we're excited that they helped Dr. Blewett get this project started, and now we'll be co-funding a much larger project looking at the effects of activation of these particular genes in the PWS region. And Dr. Blewett's made this super nice, it was out on Facebook the last couple of days, video about the project that you can look at that I think is really explains it beautifully. So the final two grants that we'll talk about have to do with brain and clinical evaluation and optimization of care. So the first project is really focused on behavior and social cognition and autism-like behaviors in our kids with PWS. And this is a study from Dr. Gallagher, who is at Trinity College in Dublin. And it's focused on social cognition, which is the ability to understand the thoughts and feelings of others. And we know that this is a real challenge for our kids, and that circuitry and understanding is impaired. In addition, there's some evidence that the social rewards circuitry is also altered in PWS, and this might be contributing to some of the oppositional behavior problems that we see often in PWS. So this is Dr. Gallagher's area of expertise, understanding social cognition, understanding reward circuitry in individuals with various neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism. And in this study, she'll carefully evaluate these aspects of PWS. her team is going to apply cognitive testing, clinical assessments, and biomarker studies in PWS individuals and kind of look at that in the larger context of other autism syndromes and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So this is interesting to us. We're excited to support it because Dr. Gallagher, she is the chair of psychiatry at Trinity College. She has a lot of experience in autism and in leading research studies to understand the intricacies of social development in kids with autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. We believe that this project will lead to a better understanding of what drives those social impairments in PWS and the atypical behaviors and sometimes challenging behaviors, and will lead to more effective interventions that will improve the ability of our kids to interact socially with others. The final grant is one from Dr. Rice at the University of Sydney in Australia, and it is looking at a potential new target for treatment in PWS. And this is an interesting study that combines brain imaging study and a therapeutic evaluation in one. So this team, Dr. Rice and Dr. Stuart Einfeld at University of Sydney their real interest is understanding temper outbursts and behavior in PWS. And they've done a lot of work to try to understand, what is the basis of the frequent and sometimes dramatic temper outbursts that our kids and adults with PWS have. And what they found is that they believe that a brain chemical, GABA, is decreased in individuals with PWS. And the more it's decreased, the more likely those individuals are to experience temper outbursts. And so there's this imbalance between excitatory and inhibitory signals in the brain of individuals with PWS. And this study is going to look at whether they can kind of get that back in balance and whether they can visualize that in brain imaging studies and whether there is an effect that you can see behaviorally. So they're going to look at the GABA modulating drug. There's several of them, but they're going to look at this one, acamprosate, and see whether it has a beneficial effect on individuals with PWS. So we like this because it's an experienced research team that really understands temper outbursts in PWS. Temper outbursts is a real problem in those individuals who experience them and their families. It really impairs quality of life. And this study is going to both provide some fundamental information about changes in brain chemistry that causes temper outbursts and also evaluate a therapy that might restore that balance and hopefully reduce temper problems in individuals with PWS. So this study, long-term, we hope will confirm the hypothesis about this imbalance and establish a new potential route of therapy for challenging behavior in PWS. So that's all of the grants that we are funding in the first half of 2019, what to expect in the remainder of the year. I think, we now have a lot of projects ongoing, many of which are coming to fruition and giving us more insights into PWS, the basic biology of PWS, the care of individuals with PWS, and new treatments that we might try. So please keep an eye on our blog and on our website and on our Facebook page as we try to share those results with you and keep you up to date on all of the things that this research is showing us. We will have an emphasis this year on mental health and optimizing care for mental health in individuals with PWS, which is obviously an area of importance to our families. We'll be looking for the initial outcomes of the PATH Natural History Study, looking at serious medical events that occur in PWS, what is sending our kids to the hospital, and what are the things that are most challenging for our families. We'll continue to use the Global PWS Registry to support research and advance clinical trials. And we'll start to see, the results of some of those clinical trials that are ongoing now. So again, We won't get to the results if we don't get those trials fully enrolled. So please consider whether one of those trials might be right for you and your family. Talk to your doctor about them. And if you feel like you are comfortable with the risks and the benefits that any of those clinical trials might offer, please make the commitment to go ahead and enroll so that we can advance therapies for everyone in the PWS community. And we'll be continuing to interact with the FDA on a regular basis. I've been up to the FDA, I think 3 or 4 times already this year. So they're getting very familiar with PWS, which is a good thing. The PWS Clinical Trials Consortium will continue to help the FDA understand the subtleties of PWS and the unmet needs in our community. And we'll be setting the stage ultimately to have insurance companies provide reimbursement for some of these drugs if we can get them approved. Our next hurdle that we'll have to jump through is actually getting the insurance companies to pay for them. So we're already thinking about that and laying the groundwork for that. And then please, if you can, join us in New Orleans in October for our FPWR meeting. I think there's going to be a lot of great science and great information shared there, and we look forward to seeing you. So with that, I will stop and take any additional questions that Susan may have acquired.
Thank you, Theresa. It is always so helpful, even for me, to listen to you go through these projects and explain not just why they were funded, but what they mean, what they could potentially mean for us in the future. We do have a number of questions that have come in. I'm trying to organize them a little bit around the projects that you were describing. I'll do my best. Let's start with the brain imaging study that you were describing with Dr. Rice. So she's using brain imaging to measure GABA in the brain. It sounded like, is there a way to measure this through labs, or does it require brain scans in order to know that your GABA levels are low?
I believe, and this is not my area of expertise, but I believe that you have to do the brain scans, and it has to be a particular kind of brain scan. So, so it's fairly specialized.
Great. And you mentioned that she's going to be utilizing a pharmacological therapeutic on patients to see if there is an improvement. Is this something that is already on the shelves that's been FDA approved, or is this a new novel drug?
Well, there's my understanding, again, and again, this is not my area of expertise, is that there's several drugs in development, some of which may be, so this is a study in Australia, so I don't know the status of the drugs, for example, in the US. Some of the drugs I know are in clinical development and are not approved in any country yet. I'm not sure, honestly, about this particular one. I can find out if that person wants to email me. I will find out and get it to you. But I think that it is, has never been tested in PWS. And so I would say that using it in a clinical study like this is the best way to really understand if it has the effect that they're expecting and if it has a beneficial effect.
Right. Now, I've heard of people, and again, this is just reading on Facebook, there are people who are trying to supplement GABA with supplements. Yeah. Is that possible?
My understanding of those supplements is that most of them do not cross the blood-brain barrier, so it's not. And actually, there are some GABA drugs that can cause weight increase. So, I think this is something that is best left to the professionals, and maybe would be good to. I know people are anxious, but hold on a year and see what this particular study shows.
Great. Okay, going back a little bit further into the studies, you talked about Dr. Resnick, who is developing a mouse model, and he's going to switch on this NORD116 gene at different times during development to see, when the best time is for this gene reactivation. What's the duration of that study? It sounds like it's pretty in-depth. He has to create the model, and then he has to do the study. How long is that going to take?
Well, yeah, it'll take a little while. So, creating the model will probably take, I would anticipate, 6 to 8 months. And then you have to start the studies where, yeah, you have to breed up the mice and then you turn it on at different ages and things. So, my expectation is that, this again is kind of a seed funding to get this project started. And then I would anticipate that, FPWR might support it for 2 years. Um, we will support a project for a maximum of 2 years. So this project is probably one of those that would need a second year of support if it's going well. And then for additional studies, you might then need to take it into like NIH funding or some other funding. I think you'd be able to get an initial read on some of the developmental questions within a 2-year period. But some of the more subtle things, like some of the questions that we would want to ask, I would think is, what if you just turn the genes on in the hypothalamus? Would that be corrective? And maybe that would be an easier thing to do from a gene therapy standpoint. So all of those detailed questions it'll be a couple of years. So the gene activation, I think, those studies are going to take several years, and but yeah, they're just going to take a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So they're long-term objectives.
Right. Yes.
So going to the other gene therapy project that you talked about with Dr. Blewett, she's talking about turning on what she characterizes as sleeping genes. Will other non-PWS sleeping genes be awakened as well, or is she really focusing just on the PWS region?
So you're right. There may be some other genes that get turned on with that approach. So the first thing is, it really is not all of the genes in the PWS region. So that particular protein really is important in silencing MAGEL2, nectin, McCorin, but not so much in silencing SNORD116. So this will turn on a particular subset of genes. And that's actually, from a knowledge gaining point of view, I think really important. So what happens if you turn on MAGEL2 in a PWS person? Would that be beneficial? But that study will also need to look at what other genes get turned on. That particular protein does not regulate that many genes, so it should be relatively specific, but you will have to look at, and that's when we talk about off-target and on-target effects, we'll have to look at that as well, because chances are there will be some other genes that also get turned on, and we'll have to determine, or she'll have to determine, that those don't cause a problem. So any of these gene activation approaches, it's balancing, trying to improve the specificity so that it is specific for the PWS region, but robust enough to achieve that. And that's why we're supporting several different gene activation approaches, because it's not clear yet what's going to work the best.
Great. So FPWR has funded a number of gene activation, gene therapy type projects. How is this project different?
It's just, like I said, it's just a different approach using a different protein. So the Lalande lab was looking at, silencing genes is a very complex process. And so the Lalande lab was looking at different proteins that are also important in silencing this region. And the Blewett lab is looking at this other protein. And again, it's not clear which one is going to be the best way to move forward until we get these studies done.
Mm-hmm. So we have some questions regarding the hunger satiety project that you discussed. Could you tell us a little bit more about hunger versus satiety, and how could these be addressed? Or do they need to be addressed differently? Are these two separate challenges?
I think that's a great question, and I don't know that it's entirely clear yet. there are certainly different neurons that, so these are redundant systems. That's been one of the issues, is that there's a lot of redundancy in your hunger and satiety mechanisms. So there are certain neurons, these AGRP neurons, that are pushing the hunger. There's POMC neurons that are important in satiety, but there's other things that are important in satiety. And again, that signal from your belly up to your brain saying, okay, my belly is full, is one of those. So I think that they, all of these signals kind of converge, and understanding how they work against each other and with each other is really important. And I think these couple of projects, as well as another couple of projects that we're funding, will help us really understand that. But it's super complex. And I guess that is to be expected, because regulating our appetite is obviously really important for surviving. But I think that people weren't expecting it to be quite as complex as it really is when they thought about it 10 or 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I have one final question in the queue. Again, audience, any of our audience members who are out there, you're welcome to continue to send any questions into us. We're happy to answer them. However, the one that I have currently here is, so we have several clinical trials currently ongoing, underway. How is FPWR going to help with getting these drugs approved once the trials are completed?
Well, I think that's the work of the Clinical Trial Consortium. So, and in fact, I was just at earlier last week, the FDA is revamping what they call their benefit risk assessment. So what the FDA does is they get from the drug company the benefits of a clinical drug, and also they look at the risks, and then they balance that against the unmet need in a community. So, I mean, if it's so the things that we've tried to convey through the Clinical Trial Consortium and the work of the Clinical Trial Consortium are things that, like, our kids can't be taught just to, regulate their appetite and eat healthy, right? They have a biological drive to eat that is overwhelming. And so our needs are different than an obesity drug in the normal population, for example. So, understanding the impact on a person, understanding the impact on the family, understanding the risk that our kids have of overeating and, rupturing their stomach, and balancing that against the risks and benefits of a new drug is really what the FDA needs to consider. So working with the FDA to understand those things, providing that information. Many of you participated in the surveys that we've done about treatment preferences and about caregiver burden. That's all the information that we're wrapping up and handing over to the FDA so that they really understand our situation and how it's different than normal obesity. And everybody feels hungry, but that is not the same as PWS. So we're continuing that work. We had a critical path meeting that's a special meeting that you have with the FDA. The consortium had that in November and got some additional feedback from the FDA about information that we can provide to them. So that is ongoing work, and we really appreciate the work of everybody in the community who has participated in any of those studies. It's been really important for that. And like I said, all of that information is going to be then useful if we do get approval of a drug to then get the insurance companies to pay for it. So please continue to contribute to those efforts with your time and your expertise on PWS and how it impacts your life.
Great. So some ways that you all can help and get involved. As you've seen and heard in today's webinar, there's a lot of research that's taking place. There's a lot of questions that we still need to answer. The families, we may not be able to perform the research, but we can certainly help accelerate it. We can help provide researchers with information through the registry, through the Path for PWS study. When researchers ask for tissue donations, such as the baby teeth, you can provide those. Certainly participating in an ongoing clinical trial would be very helpful. But for many of us who are not eligible, either our child is too young or child does not have hyperphagia, whatever the reason may be, you can continue to help us by spreading the word. Talk about these trials, share these trials. Facebook is a great vehicle for us to continue to share information. When it's relevant to you, please share the work that we're doing with others. We need to help every member of our community stay aware of the current opportunities that are out there for these clinical trials and really help to get them enrolled. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today and supporting these programs. It's because of you that we're making the strides that we're making in research, and we truly do thank you for your incredible support. Have a wonderful rest of your May Awareness Month, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.